welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into some absolutely fascinating research by Choi Won-hyuk. We're going to look at how two very distinct Eastern philosophies, Donghak and Dae-soon, tried to totally redefine the universe to make sense of a rapidly modernizing world.
Imagine you're standing at this massive cultural crossroads. For centuries, traditional Neo-Confucianism set all the rules for how reality basically works, right? But suddenly, the world is modernizing at breakneck speed. And those old rules, they just don't fit anymore. So what do? What actually happens when you try to take ancient views of the cosmos and essentially upgrade them for a modern universe? Well, that's the exact dilemma these two schools of thought were up against.
To unpack all this, we're going to start by seeking modern Eastern thought, then explore Donghak and transcendent ghosts, look at Dae-soon and divine sincerity, and wrap it all up with a philosophical comparison.
All right, let's jump straight into part one, seeking modern Eastern thought.
So here's the crucial thing to understand. Both Donghak and Dae-soon were desperately searching for a modern turning point. They realized pretty quickly that they had to move past the traditional yin-yang views of Neo-Confucianism. In that older system, heaven and earth were just these naturalistic, physical manifestations of yin and yang. But both of these new philosophies made a massive conceptual leap. They introduced this idea of a transcendent heaven. They figured there just had to be something higher, something way beyond the physical mechanics of the universe that was actually orchestrating reality.
Moving on to part two, Donghak and transcendent ghosts. Okay, let's look at the term Chanji Guisen, which translates to heaven and earth ghosts. Now, let's bust a myth right out of the gate here. In this specific Eastern philosophical context, a ghost is definitely not some spooky spirit haunting an old house. Instead, it refers to a completely impersonal, transcendent creator force known as Chano-chan. Literally, that means a heaven beyond heaven. So Donghak is basically saying that our reality is shaped by the profound principles of this entirely transcendent realm.
But you might be wondering, how does a purely transcendent realm actually create the physical stuff, the dirt, the water, the air we interact with every day? Well, Donghak explains this using something they call a vaporization effect, or jihwa. This idea describes how the vital, ultimate energy of that transcendental heaven shifts, changes, and literally materializes to form the real world we live in. It's this beautifully abstract way of describing the mechanics of creation. Honestly, it's almost like an ancient philosophical version of quantum physics.
And this foundational quote from the moral song of the young Damusa really anchors that whole Donghak belief system. When it says, heaven and earth too are ghosts and spirits, it's reinforcing that the very fabric of our physical reality is woven entirely from these transcendent cosmic forces. It's a totally impersonal universe, sure, but it's one vibrating with this absolute transcendent energy that dictates the way and virtue of life.
All right, let's shift gears to part three, Dae-soon and divine sincerity. Here is where we run into the concept of Qianji Senyang Shen. Now, unlike Donghak's purely impersonal energy, Dae-soon explicitly names the divine. They believe the universe doesn't just passively exist, right? Instead, it operates through the very intentional personal strength of specific gods across the nine heavens. So we're talking about a highly active administrated universe, where heaven and earth are strictly governed by divine beings who have distinct identities. Dae-soon actually structures this highly personal universe through the power of threes. Think of it as a structural triangle linking the nine heavens, the divine gods, and humanity. And how exactly are these 3 points connected? Well, they're bound together by a triad of human duty: Song, Gyong, and Shin. That translates to sincerity, reverence, and trust. In this worldview, the universe literally responds directly to your personal sincerity and trust in the divine. Just ask yourself for a second, if your life, your lifespan, and your good fortune were literal gifts given to you by the Holy Spirit of the heavens, how would you even go about repaying the universe? Dae-soon's answer is right here in this quote, Chalenji Bowen, which means grateful reciprocation. The logic is that because the gods act with utmost sincerity to run the universe, humans have a duty to reflect that exact same sincerity, reverence, and faith right back up to the heavens. It's a deeply reciprocal, two-way street.
Let's bring it all together in part 4, a philosophical comparison.
So, a major point where these two diverge in their quest for modernity is how they viewed the West. Donghak, which literally translates to Eastern learning, actively opposed Western influence. They were highly antagonistic towards Sohak, or Western learning. But Dae-soon, they took an incredibly inclusive stance. The term Dae-soon itself implies a grand circulation, and they actually suggested that Western modernity had Eastern origins. This clever framing allowed them to integrate and embrace modern global changes instead of just fighting them.
When you put them side by side like this, the contrast is super clear. Donghak gives us this transcendent heaven and the impersonal ghosts of energy, but it completely lacks a divine name. Daesoon, on the flip side, actively embraces the concept of divine names. And this really gets to the core of Choi Won-yeag's research. While both philosophies were striving for modern thinking, they fundamentally disagreed on whether a modernized universe actually required a specific divine name to function properly.
Academically speaking, the research concludes that Donghak ultimately failed to achieve a complete, spontaneous modernity. And why is that? Well, basically because it kept things a bit too abstract. Without a specific divine name, the system just couldn't fully bridge that massive gap between a transcendent heaven and everyday human social structures. Daesoon, however, by actively embracing the divine name, was able to supplement, develop, and really complete its modern philosophical system. It essentially anchored the infinite, abstract universe to a personal, relatable divine structure.
Which really brings us back to the core of the human experience. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When you're faced with the totally overwhelming scale of reality, does giving the universe a specific, divine name make it easier to navigate? How do the labels and names we give to the vast, vast unknown ultimately shape the modern reality we build for ourselves? It's something to think about. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today. Keep questioning and keep learning.